right, today we're going deep, really deep into the life of Ibrahim Babangida,
A fascinating figure.
using his autobiography, A Journey in Service, as our main source.
Which is interesting in itself, right? Because it's basically his attempt to kind of like grapple with his legacy.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's not just a straight history book. It's more like, well, here's my side of the story.
It's his perspective.
And we're going to unpack all of that, the events, his decisions, the controversies, all those things that shaped his journey.
And that, in turn, shaped Nigeria as a nation.
And it's a journey, by the way, that could have been completely different if not for...
Name change.
Oh, really? Wait, is this about how he wasn't always Ibrahim Babangida?
Yeah, he started out as Ibrahim Badamasi.
Badamasi.
But when he was at the Nigerian Military Training College,
Okay.
some officers thought Badamasi was a Yoruba name. And to avoid any confusion, he just adopted his father's other name, Babangida.
So a case of mistaken identity basically changed the course of history.
You could say that.
Wow, that's wild. But okay, let's rewind even further back to his childhood.
Sure.
His family background, I think, offers some pretty interesting insights.
Oh, absolutely.
Like his grandfather was this revered Islamic scholar, and he named Ibrahim's father after this important religious book, Badamasi.
Right, which just shows you how central faith and tradition were to Ibrahim's upbringing.
It really paints a picture of his early influences, you know? And then there's how he talks about his primary school teachers.
Oh, with such fondness?
Yeah, like Mr. Kuta, his English teacher, Mr. Kuta actually taught himself English fluently.
That's dedication.
It makes you wonder, did Mr. Kuta, like, spark that love for language that led to Ibrahim writing his autobiography?
It's possible. I mean, a great teacher can leave a lasting mark, you know?
Absolutely. And speaking of lasting marks, there's this story about his classmate nicknamed Baba Sungo.
Oh, yeah, with the rough palms.
Legend has it if he slapped you.
The marks stayed for days.
That's one way to leave an impression. But, you know, his schooling, it almost sent him down a completely different path.
Really?
He was amazing at math, so good that one teacher suggested he become an engineer.
Interesting.
But the closest he got to that was fixing tanks in the Armored Corps.
It's funny how life works out sometimes.
It really is. But think about it. His interest in engineering, that kind of foreshadows his analytical mind, right?
Oh, definitely. His strategic thinking. That comes up later in his political and economic decisions, for sure.
Right. And speaking of unexpected turns, how does a future president end up drawn to tanks, of all things?
That's a good question.
What does choosing the Armored Corps tell us about him?
I mean, it wasn't the typical path for someone with political ambitions, right? So it suggests a certain comfort with power, you know?
Okay.
A willingness to be at the front lines.
Interesting.
Maybe even a hint of that, rebellious streak we see when he challenged those school rules as a teenager.
Yeah, like he wasn't afraid to question things, to push boundaries. It seems like those leadership qualities were there from the beginning.
Yeah, they were brewing for sure.
And get this, his military career almost didn't happen at all.
What do you mean?
He was actually on track to become an engineer, but then Captain Gowan, the Gowan, visited his secondary school and kind of planted that seed of a military future.
And talk about foreshadowing, right? Gowan becomes a pretty important figure later on.
Right. It's like a pivotal moment, a chance encounter that changed everything.
It really highlights how these seemingly random events can redirect a whole life.
Totally. And then his time at the NMTC, the Nigerian Military Training College, that further cemented this path.
It's amazing how many future leaders were in his class,
Like who?
Theophilus Danjuma, Samuel Ogbamudia.
Wow.
Makes you wonder, was it just coincidence, or did the training itself create this generation of leaders?
That's a great question. It makes you think about how shared experiences shape leadership.
Yes.
And it's worth noting, the NMTC was modeled after the Indian Armed Forces Training Institute.
Oh, interesting.
They even had Indian instructors.
I didn't know that.
So how did that international cooperation, having these Indian instructors, and influence the development of the early Nigerian military?
Well, it shows that even in its early stages, the Nigerian military was connected to the wider world.
Right.
And that exposure, internationally, it probably influenced their training, their strategies, even their understanding of global military affairs.
That makes sense. And that global context, it becomes even more important as we move into the 1960s. A pretty turbulent time for Nigeria and the world, for that matter.
Oh, absolutely.
The Cold War was in full swing.
Right.
Newly independent nations like Nigeria were dealing with internal tensions and all this external pressure.
A lot to navigate.
So how did this global backdrop influence what happened in Nigeria?
Well, the Cold War had a huge impact on post-colonial Africa. You had superpowers vying for influence, often supporting different sides in these internal conflicts.
It created this complex web of alliances and rivalries, which just made things worse within Nigeria.
And those tensions, they kind of exploded in 1966 with the first coup led by Major Niziogu.
A turning point.
At first, it was seen as this move against corruption. But things quickly escalated into ethnic violence, targeting prominent northern leaders.
Right.
The book actually goes into detail about the killings of Sir Ahmadu Bello and his wife.
It was a brutal time.
So how did that violence, how did it shape the public's perception of the coup?
Well, the killings of figures like Sir Ahmadu Bello, it really inflamed ethnic tensions.
Yeah.
And that initial idea of the coup being about fighting corruption, it got overshadowed by fear and anger.
It shifted the narrative.
Completely. And the targeted killings, no matter what the original intention was, they created this narrative of ethnic strife that had lasting consequences.
And then just a few months later, the counter-coup happens.
Even more violence.
It's chilling reading Babangida's account of the Abeokuta massacre,
where Igbo officers were targeted. Yeah, it's a stark reminder that coups are rarely clean or predictable.
Absolutely.
The violence of the counter-coup, especially the Abeokuta massacre, it solidified this cycle of fear and retribution that would really plague Nigerian politics for years to come.
And that cycle's hard to break.
It really is. And in the middle of all this chaos, Yakubu Gowon,
the same captain who inspired Babangida years earlier,
emerges as the head of state.
It's almost poetic.
And it's important to remember he wasn't the obvious choice. There were powerful factions pushing for different outcomes.
Even secession.
So how did Gowon manage to secure leadership, and what does that tell us about his political skills?
Well, Gowon's rise to power, it really shows his ability to navigate these incredibly complex political dynamics. He wasn't necessarily the strongest or most popular figure, but he emerged as this compromise candidate, someone who could bridge the divides.
Someone who could offer a sense of unity.
Exactly.
But that unity would be tested as the nation plunges into civil war.
A defining moment for Nigeria.
Babangida was right there on the front lines, commanding a battalion at the Okigwe front.
A far cry from his idyllic childhood.
Yeah, it really highlights the brutal reality of war.
Absolutely. And for Babangida, it was a trial by fire where leadership and survival were intertwined.
And these experiences, they would shape his worldview and his future decisions.
For sure.
And amidst all this turmoil, he finds love, gets married to Miriam in 1969.
Wow, amidst all that.
He even assures her that he won't take multiple wives.
A bold statement for a man of his stature at the time.
Right, so is this a genuine commitment to monogamy or a calculated move to, improve his public image?
It's hard to say for sure, but it does offer a glimpse into his personal life and the complexities of balancing personal aspirations with public perception.
Right. The fact that he even felt the need to make that promise, it speaks volumes about societal expectations at the time.
And the challenges women faced.
Absolutely. Okay, so the war ends. Gowon's no victor, no vanquish policy kind of sets the stage for rebuilding. And Babangida gets assigned to rehabilitation work in Umuahia.
A big shift from the front lines.
He sees firsthand the poverty and just desperation in what was Biafran territory.
It must have been a profound experience.
It really must have been.
He talks about forming genuine friendships with people who just months before were literally on the opposite side of the battlefield.
Wow.
That says something about his ability to empathize, right?
Yeah, a quality that you don't always see in military leaders.
And it's crucial for navigating the complexities of reconciliation, nation building.
Totally. And it's also around this time that he gets news that Miriam has given birth to their first child, a daughter named Aishatu.
New life amidst the ruins of war.
It's a powerful image, right?
Yeah, it highlights that cyclical nature of history. Even after destruction, there's hope, renewal, a drive to create a better future.
A better future for the next generation.
Exactly.
And for Babangida, that future included as a surprising turn.
What's that?
Teaching at the Nigerian Defense Academy.
The NDA?
The NDA. And what's even more surprising is the roster of his students.
Oh, yeah. Like who?
David Mark.
Okay.
Timothy Shalpidi.
Yeah.
And get this, Sani Abacha.
No way. The future head of state.
Your future head of state, it's crazy to think that he played a role in shaping the minds of these people who would later hold so much power.
It's mind-boggling. Some became allies, others rivals.
Yeah, but their destinies were intertwined from that point on.
It's like a historical thriller unfolding.
Right. But while he's at the NDA, the nation's undergoing its own transformation under Gowon.
The oil boom.
The oil boom, exactly. Prosperity, but also, some shadows lurking beneath the surface.
Yeah, there's always another side to the story.
The indigentization decree meant to, transfer control of industries to Nigerians.
Right.
It had mixed results, created opportunities for corruption, cronyism.
Ill-intentioned, but
Yeah, it shows the
rather-
challenges of economic transformation.
For sure, it aimed to empower Nigerians, but also fueled inequality and hampered growth in the long run.
A cautionary tale.
A classic one.
And speaking of unintended consequences, the 1975 coup led by Murtala Mohammed, that changed everything.
Yeah, radically.
Gowon is ousted, a new era begins.
And how did Babangida navigate this new reality, especially considering his ties to Gowon?
He seems to have adapted pretty well. He was appointed commander of the Armored Corps.
A key position.
Yeah, putting him at the heart of the military establishment. And then just a year later, his leadership is put to the test during the Dimka coup attempt.
Oh, wow.
This was a direct challenge to Mohammed's leadership, full of twists and turns.
Like something out of a spy novel?
It really was, and Babangida's account of confronting Dimka at the radio house, it's incredible.
Tell me about it.
He approaches him unarmed, appeals to his sense of responsibility, even mentions Dimka's family's safety.
That's risky.
It was a risky move, but it worked.
Takes a lot of courage to face down a coup leader like that.
It really does, but the aftermath, it was brutal.
Yeah.
Many involved, including Dimka, were executed.
Wow.
And the government used retroactive laws to punish them.
That's always a tricky issue.
It raises serious questions about justice and due process.
It does. I mean, while the desire for stability and accountability is understandable,
Right.
undermining legal norms can have dangerous consequences in the long run.
Definitely. It makes you wonder if these events, if they made Babangida question the military's role in governance.
Yeah, he saw the violence, the instability these coups generated.
It's not just an abstract idea. It becomes very real when you've witnessed the chaos firsthand.
Absolutely. And after Mohammed's assassination, Obasanjo takes over.
Right.
Babangida continues to rise through the ranks,
Yeah.
eventually becoming chief of army staff in '83.
But his relationship with the Buhari regime, that was full of tension.
Yeah, this is where we really see Babangida, the political strategist, emerge.
Right. He becomes increasingly disillusioned with Buhari's authoritarian tendencies.
And the book even mentions him being placed under surveillance, his communications monitored.
His family's privacy invaded.
It wasn't just a difference of opinion. It was a clash of values, of visions for Nigeria's future.
And in 1985, that clash comes to a head.
The coup.
Babangida leads a bloodless coup, ousting Buhari.
A bold move.
He frames it as a necessary intervention to save the nation from authoritarianism.
A classic justification.
Right, he positions himself as a reluctant but necessary leader.
Someone who had to step in to protect freedoms.
But did he genuinely believe this, or was it a way to legitimize his actions?
It's tough to know for sure, but his actions do speak volumes.
Right, he immediately initiates a review and reform of Buhari's decrees.
Trying to undo some of that authoritarianism.
Exactly, and he embarks on this ambitious campaign to connect with the people, build consensus.
Projecting a vision of a new Nigeria.
And part of that vision was addressing Nigeria's economic crisis.
Ah, yes, the era of structural adjustment programs.
SAPs championed by the IMF and World Bank,
Sweeping economic reforms.
aimed at tackling inflation, debt, inefficient state-owned enterprises.
But were they the right solution for Nigeria?
That's the question, right?
SAPs are controversial, then and now, often criticized for prioritizing macroeconomic indicators over people's well-being.
Yeah, the devaluation of the naira, that led to skyrocketing inflation.
Hitting the poor the hardest.
So how did Babangida address that criticism? Did he acknowledge the potential for social unrest?
He did, and he took a surprising step.
What was that?
He held a nationwide debate about taking an IMF loan, invited everyday Nigerians to weigh in.
Wow, that's unexpected.
It was bold, opening himself up to criticism, dissent,
But it also allowed him to gauge public sentiment,
and build support for difficult decisions.
which these decisions were.
Currency devaluation, privatization, the creation of new banks, the NDIC, a massive overhaul.
Aimed at attracting foreign investment, fostering competition.
But at what cost?
Exactly. The social unrest he anticipated, it did materialize.
Protests, riots.
Fueled by anger over rising prices, economic hardship.
So did his vision for long-term stability blind him to the immediate suffering.
It's hard to say for sure, but he did try to mitigate some of the negative impacts.
How so?
He established things like the People's Bank, community banks, specifically to provide credit to the poor.
Okay.
He launched ambitious programs like DFRRI
The Directorate of Food, Roads, and Rural Infrastructure.
to boost agriculture, improve rural living standards.
So a genuine effort to create a more inclusive economy.
It seems that way, but the question remains, were these efforts enough to counterbalance the pain of SAP?
Or were they just Band-Aids on a much deeper wound?
It's complicated, no easy answers.
Definitely.
And this is just one piece of the puzzle that is Ibrahim Babangida's legacy.
Right. We've talked about his economic reforms.
But his foreign policy was equally bold and at times controversial.
Oh, absolutely.
He pushed for a stronger role for Africa on the global stage, even advocating for a permanent seat for Africa on the UN Security Council.
He saw Nigeria as a leader on the continent.
And he wasn't afraid to make bold moves, resuming diplomatic ties with Israel, for example.
That was highly controversial, especially within the Muslim community.
It was. So what motivated that decision, and how did it affect Nigeria's relationships with other nations?
It was a calculated risk, potentially alienating some allies while forging new ones.
A balancing act?
It shows his willingness to prioritize what he saw as Nigeria's national interest, even if it meant defying conventional wisdom.
And there's this amazing story about how Nigeria saved the OAU summit in 1989.
I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So Ethiopia, the original host, was in the middle of a civil war.
Oh, wow.
And Babangida steps up at the last minute, offers to host it in Abuja.
But Abuja was still under construction.
It was, but they pulled it off.
This was a brilliant move. It showcased Nigeria's capabilities, boosted its image, solidified its leadership within the OAU.
Talk about a gamble that paid off.
It definitely did. But despite those successes on the international stage, the challenges at home kept mounting.
So we've seen Babangida's rise through the military, his economic reforms, his foreign policy moves, but as his time in office went on, things get, well, they get more complicated.
The stakes get higher, for sure.
There's a real shift in the narrative.
Like the weight of leadership, the constant threat of instability, it starts to take a toll.
And then there's the murder of Della Giwa in 1986.
A tragic event.
Giwa, this fearless journalist, known for criticizing the government, killed by a parcel bomb.
It sent shockwaves through the nation.
It really did, and it raised all these questions about press freedom, government accountability.
And of course, Babangida denies any involvement.
He does vehemently, both in the book and throughout his life.
Yeah.
He talks about being shaken by the incident, confronting his chief of staff, General Vatsa, about the rumors.
But could he really have been in the dark about something like that?
I mean, it's hard to imagine, right? Someone so close to him orchestrating this without his knowledge.
It's difficult to reconcile the image of Babangida as this strategic mastermind with the idea that such a major event could happen under his watch, without him knowing.
Right, and the book portrays him as genuinely shocked, even betrayed by the possibility of an inside job.
It makes you think about the limits of control, even for a leader as powerful as Babangida.
And the Giwa murder, it really cast a shadow over his presidency.
It did. It fueled distrust, intensified scrutiny from the media, created this atmosphere of fear and suspicion.
Like the very foundation of trust, essential for any leader, was broken.
Yet trust is crucial, especially in a nation transitioning to democracy with a history of military interventions.
Right, and the Giwa murder, it eroded that trust, made it harder for Babangida to implement his vision.
It's a setback for sure.
And then, as if things couldn't get more complicated, he faces a coup attempt in 1987, led by General Vatsa.
His close friend, Confidante,
The book describes their relationship as like brothers.
making the betrayal even more profound.
Absolutely, and the coup plot itself, it was chilling. They planned to bomb key infrastructure, even hijack the presidential jet.
It's serious.
It makes you wonder, was Babangida naive to trust Vatsa so completely? Or were there signs he missed?
It's a question historians still debate. Did he misjudge Vatsa's character? Or underestimate the allure of power?
The book offers a glimpse into his emotional state, the sense of betrayal, but it doesn't fully address the question of his own role, you know? Did he misread the situation?
It's a tough one to answer.
It really is, and the Vatsa coup attempt was just one of several challenges to his authority.
Right. There was also the Orkhar coup attempt in 1990.
A much more brazen and violent affair.
That one forced Babangida into a bunker, right?
It did. Soldiers stormed the presidential residence. It really highlights how precarious his hold on power was.
A constant threat.
And then there's the Ebony magazine scandal, which, while not as violent as a coup, really damaged his public image.
What happened there?
They published this fabricated story accusing Babangida and his inner circle of massive corruption. And even though it was debunked, the damage was done.
It shows the power of misinformation. especially in an environment already full of distrust.
Yeah, how easily public opinion can be swayed.
It's a cautionary tale that resonates even today.
Absolutely. And by this point, those carefully laid plans for a transition to civilian rule, they were starting to unravel.
Right, he'd established a political bureau, created new states, held local elections, even designed a two-party system.
All aimed at ensuring a smooth handover of power.
A lot of groundwork.
But the ghosts of past coups, the rumors of corruption, the erosion of public trust, it all created this uncertainty leading up to the June 12th election in 1992.
An election considered to be the freest and fairest in Nigerian history up to that point.
With so much hope riding on it.
The candidates, Abiola and Tofa, they represented a new generation of politicians.
Untainted by military rule.
There was a real sense that Nigeria was on the verge of a true democratic transition.
But then Babangida annuls the election results.
A controversial move.
A move that plunged the nation into a crisis with lasting consequences.
So how does he justify this? After years of planning for a return to civilian rule,
He points to internal pressures within the military, fears of instability if Abiola took power, concerns about ethnic conflict.
he's essentially saying it was a necessary evil to prevent greater chaos.
He even claims to have offered Abiola an interim position as a compromise.
But Abiola refused.
Rightfully so. He believed he had won the election.
It's a missed opportunity for a peaceful transfer of power.
A heartbreaking one.
The annulment of June 12th? It's still a deeply controversial topic.
It is. Some see it as a necessary evil, others as a blatant power grab.
A betrayal of the democratic process.
And the fallout was immediate. Protests erupted, the military was further divided, and Babangida was forced to step down.
Handing power over to an interim government.
A chaotic end to his rule.
So what's the final verdict? What's Ibrahim Babangida's legacy?
It's complicated. He's remembered as a brilliant strategist, a master of political maneuvering.
But also a leader who implemented both groundbreaking reforms and devastating policies.
His autobiography, it offers a glimpse into his mind, his motivations, his struggles, but it doesn't give us easy answers.
It leaves us grappling with the complexities of his legacy, the lasting impact of his decisions, both good and bad.
I think that's the key takeaway here. Babangida's story reminds us that leadership is messy, often contradictory.
It's a story of ambition, power, vision, and ultimately the human flaws that shape even the most influential lives.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into the life and times of Ibrahim Babangida, a journey through Nigerian history that, frankly, leaves us with more questions than answers.
But hopefully it sparked your curiosity.
And inspired you to explore this fascinating story further.
As always, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep seeking those deeper meanings.
Until next time.